Hey students, this is a lesson 7. Even though the project is done, this is not even a completed version. I want to talk about some of the other tools that we didn't use in our basic skills unit. So I'll just make all these invisible and we'll poke around with this layer for now. So some of these tools are going to be useful in project 1, even though we didn't use them in the basic skills unit. So let's just first of all start by talking about color. So down here on the lower left, we've been using black and white, and we know that the X key will switch between them. But if you click on one, it brings up a color tool, and you can choose whatever color you want it to be. Let's say I choose blue. Now when you choose a color, there's RGB values, like this one is R21, G72, B243. There's also a hex number, which is probably the best way. If you're ever trying to remember an exact color, you could write down this hex number. And if you came back later and pasted it in there or typed it in there, it would give you the exact same color as before. So anyway, you can pick whatever color you want. When you hit OK, you do have that as your foreground color. And you can still press X to switch between them. So if I were to create a new layer, I can go to my brush tool, E for brush, make my brush a little bit bigger. So I can paint with that color. And of course, you can adjust your opacity and the flow of that brush. There's all kinds of things you can play around with. I'll create another layer and I'll switch to the other one. And how about I pick green, that's fun. So you can see now down there I have the blue and the green, and I can switch between them using the letter X. And I'm on this second layer, blank layer that I just made, and now I'm overlapping the blue. And remember, the order of the layers matters, right? So if I make the blue layer above the green, it changes what's on top of what in the picture. So that's just a quick review, of course. So if I want these colors to be back to black and white, all I have to do is click on the little mini black and white icon there, and it will divert it back to that default. So let me just delete those layers. Okay, so that's color. And then while I'm on color, let's come down here to this. This is the eyedropper tool. And when I click on the eyedropper tool, then any pixel I click on, so like if I'm in here and if you zoom all the way in, really far in, you can actually see pixels. Every one of these squares is an example of a pixel. And if you click on a pixel, it will match that as your foreground color. You don't have to zoom in to do it though. I can just be like, oh, I want this highlight color. I'll click on that with my eyedropper and it gives me that color. If I want this exact red, I can click on that. So that's what the eyedropper tool does. Okay, moving on, we already know what the move tool does. We know about the selection tools. And also, here we have crop tool and perspective crop. Crop tool you're not going to use in our class much at all, because if you do crop something and then you double click, it crops the entire project. And I can't think of a reason why we'll do that, but it could be useful if you're doing your own thing. But perspective crop could be useful in this class, not on the project itself, but for preparing an image. For example, let's say I have another picture. I think I have one on my desktop here. So I have this picture called wall, and let's say I open this as it's a separate project here, and let's say I love this wall, but I don't like that it's angled in perspective. So I can use this perspective crop tool, and I can click and pull a rectangle. But now what I can do is I can move these points to where the true lines and corners are of the wall. So like here I lined up on this line, and then here I guess I would line up to about right there. So let's say I want this section of the wall, but I want it straight, right? So I just kind of told Photoshop or Photopea where that's at. Now I'll double click on it, and it's going to do this where it wants to straighten it out. Kind of think I want more than that. I'm going to try that again. So I'll grab it way up here and way down here. I'll keep that and pull up to this one and lower down to this one, just get a little bit more of it. Double click, and there we go. It straightens it out, so it removes the perspective, and it looks real, real straight on, I should say. So then I could then save this or export this as a JPEG, and because maybe I want to use it on a project, and then when I come back to the project, I could go File, Open in Place. I could find that picture and open it in there. Now I'm ready to use it in my project. So that's the perspective crop tool that could be useful sometimes. Down here we also have the eyedropper and the ruler. The ruler lets you straighten things. So if you pull a line on the ruler, if I'm like, oh, my horizon line's slightly crooked, I'll line this line up to the horizon line. And then when I click straighten layer, it will straighten out the layer based on that line, as if it was horizontal. Okay, then we have this set of tools, and the spot healing brush tool is the one you'll use the most. And I'll just go to my cheetah for this, and let's pretend I'm in here on the cheetah, and let's pretend I've got spots, or maybe it's a pimple, or maybe it's something that I don't want in the project. So the way that works is if I click on a spot with my brush, I have to rasterize it first, I guess. Okay, click on this spot, and look what happens. It takes a second. Photopea takes a second. Look what happened. It disappeared. If I go to this spot and I click on it one time, it takes a second. It will, there we go. It sort of heals that spot. And what Photopea is doing is it's looking at the texture, the pixels around the surrounding area, and it's filling in what it thinks you want it to look like. And sometimes it does not work out very well, and sometimes it does. Okay. Now the next one here is the healing brush tool, and it does the same thing, except the only difference is it's like the clone stamp tool where you have to hold Option and you have to target the area that we use. Holding Option, click, let go of the click. You're targeting where you want it to be sourcing itself from, and then every time you click somewhere, it's going to target or source from that same spot. Then we have these patch tools and content aware move tool. And I'm going to be honest with you, every time I've used these in Photopea, it's made the program crash. The way and it's probably going to happen here if I try it, but I'll try it one time for you. If I go to the patch tool, when you draw around an area, you have two options. You have the source and you have target. So if I click on target and I move it, it's going to take this and I can then patch over something else. And when you let go, it should kind of blend and merge. But in this case, I've not restarted my computer today. And oh, actually it worked. Look at that. Okay, so see how it sort of ghosted out? I can now deselect and it ghosted out that area. So that's what the patch tool does. I'm going to undo that. But before you use the patch tool, I highly recommend you save your work. Before you do anything, always save your work, because these tools take additional processing power, and your web browser, Google Chrome, might not have enough processing power all the time to pull it off, and it'll cause the program to freeze, and you have to close it and reopen it, and you lose all of your work. The other one is if I do this, but I click on source instead, now when I move it around, it's staying put, but I can replace it with another part of that layer, and maybe you find that to be useful. Okay. So I think I'm frozen here. Let me undo. Yeah, so I can't click off. So it's about to come up and tell me, I think that it's, oh, it actually works. So you see how long it took to process that task? Sometimes it doesn't work, so just be really careful. I'll deselect. Now I'll hit Command Z and undo that, and deselect again. All right, moving on. Content Aware Move Tool, it works in a similar way. You can play around with that. Going to the brushes, we have the brush tool and the pencil tool. I feel like the brush tool and the pencil tool are relatively the same. But let's talk about the color replacement tool. Let's say I have I'm back on the apple over here. And let's say I want to make this apple into like a blue apple. Well, the color replacement tool is a brush, but it has this target in the middle. And under sampling up here, set the brush center. So that's what I'm using, is that. So as long as I keep the center of the brush in the apple, it will see the pixels and it'll change the color. I'll just do it. Here we go. So you can see as I move it around and hit different pixels, it's in a really efficient way. It's kind of changing all those red-ish pixels to the blue color. And that's pretty neat. Now you have to be careful, and maybe it'll be easier to zoom in, but if the center of my brush here were to hit, like, yeah, you can see I accidentally hit outside the background area, so then the background area starts to turn blue as well. But it's a pretty neat little feature that you can play around with. However, I gotta admit, if I was, let's say I have this layer here and I were to remove the raster mask, just at the normal apple, you can also just take a layer where you've already isolated the image. You can go to Image Adjustments, and you could adjust hue saturation. And the hue is like the color. So this would be maybe another way to get a blue apple. And I could also dull the blue or make it super intense, or I could adjust the lightness and darkness of that blue. So I'll hit reset here. So there's a number of ways you can get different effects. Okay, so we already know about the clone stamp tool from the basic skills unit. Now we have the eraser tool and the background eraser tool. And we know that what the eraser tool does, it erases, right? The background eraser tool works like this. If I want to get rid of the gray, then I start on the gray, and then when I come in, just on the edge, it avoids the apple. You see that? So it's just erasing the background, but you have to be careful to kind of just use the fringe of the brush when you're doing that. And that can be pretty cool. I don't personally, if I want the apple isolated, I would prefer to copy and paste it, select it really well, and then copy and paste it into its own layer. That's what I would do. But that's the background eraser tool. Okay, next is a really important tool called the gradient tool. I'm going to switch back to black and white for this, and I'll make everything invisible and make a new blank layer. So here is the gradient tool. We have these options. First of all, you can see that when I click on this, there's choices, but these first three are probably the most useful. It takes a foreground color and the background color, so black to white. So if I'm in linear mode, if I click and drag a line, it's going to create a fade, or what we call a gradation or a gradient. And wherever you click and pull, that's the direction it'll go. So if you go diagonal, it'll go diagonal. If you go short, it will fade it very quickly. If you go a longer line, even off the picture, it'll do more of a gradual fade. And that's linear. If you go to radial, you can get a circular fade. Now if I switch between black and white with the X button, that's how I can change what's fading to what, or what the origin source is going to be. There's also something called angle. I don't see any real use for this. It looks pretty cool though. Then we have reflected. Reflected, basically, if you go short, you can see it's going black to white, back to black. So it's kind of a reflected approach. If I go to diamond, it's like radio, but it's more squares and diamonds like that. Okay, so those are the gradients, but let's talk about why they're useful, right? First of all, if I wanted to, let's say I had a background like this here, and I wanted it to fade to something else, I can put a raster mask on something. We know that a raster mask, whatever's white is visible, whatever's black is invisible. So if I were to use the gradient tool with black and white on a raster mask, then it's a way of doing a fade, right? You can see that on my raster mask itself is the gradient. And a gradient can be really useful to get a true transitional blend between one thing and another thing that maybe you can't pull off so easily with a brush. Or what if I try radio? What does it do? Right? So it looks very angelic, or it looks very kind of dreamlike or fantasy-like. If I go short, then it's just a little bit, right? If I go long, then you get more incorporated. Other things you could do with a gradient, say make that invisible. If I took this apple here and I put a background layer behind it, and what if I made a kind of a light to dark background, right? Actually, let me reverse that. How about dark to light, right? It's getting, and I'm going to move my apple for fun. Let's move it down here. And go back to my gradient tool and try that again. Oh, oops. Oh, yeah, I could stretch it, couldn't I? All right, so I got my apple and I move it up here. And what if I duplicated my apple? Oops, not that one. I want to, tell you what, I'll just duplicate it like this, duplicate layer. Now I have two apples. What if I took the underneath apple, I go to image, transform, flip vertically. Click. It's going to take a second, I guess. That just flipped the entire project. That is not what I wanted to do. So let me undo. I just want to flip that layer. So if I go to image, transform, did that. Layer. I did this earlier, so edit transform. There we go. So I guess edit transform is going to let me flip the layer vertically. Let's try it. There we go. So now I flipped the layer vertically. So just so you know, if you want to flip something or rotate, if you go to image transform, it does the whole project. If you do edit transform, it does just the layer. Okay. So I got this apple. I'm going to line it up here like a reflection. And then I'm going to lower the opacity of that. Look at that. That's pretty cool. So now I'm adding like a sense of space. I'm adding a sense of place, right? And I got this cool background. So all of this I just did with like the gradient tool. Or maybe instead of lowering the opacity of that, maybe I should have put a raster mask on it and used the gradient tool again on the raster mask. I'll go the other way with it. How about that? There we go. You know, and get more of a look like that. That's interesting. Kind of play around with some different ideas. That's not bad. All right, so I got this reflection with a raster mask on it, with a gradient on the raster mask to get this fadey look. I got a background gradient. So you can do some really cool stuff just with the gradient tool. Okay, Next thing I want to talk to you about is the blur tool. You're not going to use this very much, but you can smudge and blur. So if I were to already move that around, I'll go to this apple. I'll just show you how this works. So you can make your brush bigger. So right now I'm on a blur tool. Let's zoom in. And so if you click here, it will blur. You see how that highlight, all these details, they're getting blurred, right? And you can set the strength of that to different levels. Go 100%, for example. It's just going to blur it like crazy, you see? So if you need to blur something, you have a blur tool. But don't confuse blurring with blending, okay? There's also a sharpen tool, by the way, so let's play around with that. And sharpen tool, it makes the pixels sharper, but it doesn't. All right, see, I'm overly sharpening this spot on the apple. You can see how weird it looks, right? So there's such thing as too sharp. And just a reminder, sharpening doesn't make it a blurry picture more focused. It just creates a little bit more contrast in pixels. Okay, but here's a smudge tool. Let's try this out. So if you ever need to smudge things together, kind of warp them around, it's pretty crazy. This is one where maybe I would lower the strength of it a lot and see what happens. So like, you know, a little bit of movement. And this is like, let's say I was giving this apple a little bit of a touch up. Oops. Smaller brush. Kind of like smudge things around a little bit, but you do lose some image integrity when you smudge. So that's the smudge tool. And so blur tool, sharpen tool, smudge tool. And then this one's super useful. It's called, we have the dodge tool, the burn tool, and the sponge tool. And this is where we'll stop today's lesson. But how about I go to the apple here, or the cheetah, and make that invisible. There we go. So I'm on this cheetah. So the burning tool, okay, well, think of it like this. Dodging tool, think about a sunburn. So if you dodge from the sun, it'll be lighter. If you burn from the sun, it'll be darker. So if I go on the burn tool, make my brush bigger, and you can set this to your range from midtones, shadows, and highlights. But you can see if I click here, you see how it's like adding shadow. It's darkening whatever I want to darken. You see? Let me undo that. But if I do the same thing, but I use the dodge tool, make my brush big so you can see. Now it's lightening. You see? So if you ever need to lighten or darken, just kind of artistically in certain areas, you can use the burn tool and the dodge tool, okay? And the softness of your brush probably matters. So hardness 100% makes it tricky, but now when I do it, it's like a little bit more of a gradual fade. So if I like really brightened out here, but then I switched to my burn tool, lower the hardness there, and I like darkened, back there and here. That changes the whole look of the cheetah, doesn't it? By brightening and darkening. So I'm going to undo all that, get them back to normal. All right. Now on the other hand, what if I darken, but now look how dark that orange got. It's darker, but it's like a more intense orange. This tool, the sponge tool, it will adjust your saturation level. So if you go to desaturate, you can, it will suck color out. So if I like suck color out like that, it kind of grays it out, you see? So if you want to reduce the intensity of a color, you can use the sponge tool. And if you want to increase the intensity of a color, you can use the sponge tool, but set it to saturate. And now it like makes it overly saturated. Like that. So that's the, we have the blur tool, sharpen tool, smudge tool, dodge, burn, and sponge. Okay, looks like it's kind of putting them all in the same because I'm zoomed out, but if I'm at 90%, it separates these into different sets of tools. So that's interesting. I didn't know that Photopea did that. Okay, so I just want to give you a little overview of some additional tools. We learned about the ruler, the crop tool, the perspective crop tool, the eyedropper. We learned about the spot healing brush tool, the healing brush tool. We tried out the patch tool as well. We learned about the color replacement tool. We learned about the eraser and the background eraser tool. We learned about the gradient tool. And Paint Bucket, I think you guys know what that does. It just fills it all in with the same color. And we learned about the gradient tool with respect to raster masks and things and backgrounds and things like that. We learned about the blur tool, the sharpen tool, and the smudge tool. And we learned about the dodge tool, and the burn tool, and the sponge tool. So I hope that gives you a little bit more overview of some of the really cool tools that can become useful in Project 1. I'll talk to you later.